me. Eventually went to school at UMass Amherst, to University of Arizona. I cannot kick. I leave that to the LSU experts. I've worked in all sorts of geological environments. I actually started working on copper and gold mines, where I used to go out into the mountains of the West and go try to find copper and gold. And then I got into oil and gas, worked a few different projects there, and now I'm happily with Air Products, where I'm the head geologist. And today, I know there's a lot of questions out there about what is this carbon capture and sequestration that we're seeing on the news? What are we doing? What are companies doing? How does it work? And so this is what I'm here to do, talk a little bit about this. And there are mainly 3 different components of any carbon capture and sequestration project. There's the capture, which is when you have a facility, an industrial facility, where we catch CO2, carbon dioxide, before it goes into the air. You transport it, usually via pipelines, to wherever you want to store it. And finally, the sequestration piece, which is how we store it. We permanently lock that CO2 away. That's usually done with injection wells. I'm only talking about that last one today. That's my expertise as a geologist, is what happens downhole in the rocks a mile underground, where most people don't necessarily like to spend their whole lives studying rocks. So that's what I do. All right. So I want to go a little bit quickly today. You can see I have an experiment I want to show here, so I want to make sure I do get to that. And what I'll be talking about, not just from Air Products, but sort of from an industry standard, is really what is it we're talking about? What are these terms you see in the news? And how do we make it all work? So what we're looking for in sequestration is a suitable geological environment where we can lock CO2 away forever. And there are 5 main concepts geologists and others use to describe this process. The first is aquifers, both freshwater and saline. The first part, the freshwater, by EPA standards, in any sequestration project, they must be protected. And I'll talk about how we make sure that happens. The second part is you have to have a confining zone, sometimes called a seal, sometimes you hear it as a cap rock, and those are rocks where fluids cannot flow through. Those protect the aquifers above them. Next, you have sometimes called a reservoir. Sometimes you hear it called a saline aquifer. These are rocks in which fluids can flow through them. And that's what my experiment here is going to show. The other 2 are terms that can describe the confining zone and the reservoir. This is porosity and permeability. And this is the bread and butter of any geologist's work in oil and gas and sequestration. Porosity is a term that basically talks about the little tiny microscopic spaces in between grains of sand that make up a reservoir, or the lack of those little spaces in the confining zone. Permeability is a measure of how well fluids flow through those little microscopic spaces. How well connected are the spaces so that things can move through them? A confining zone should have very low permeability. It should have very low porosity. There's no space for anything to get through it. A reservoir, you want to have very high permeability, high porosity, so fluids and other substances can move through them. So how do these layers work? This is an image from the Global CCS, Carbon Capture and Sequestration Institute. And so you sort of see you generally have a system many miles deep. The first being you've got a fresh water generally at the surface, but sometimes they can go a little bit further below the surface as well. In any sequestration project, one of the first things any project that wants to do this has to do is identify where these are. Freshwater is actually a very term determined by the EPA, so that is used for not just drinking water, but also agricultural uses, and there's sort of this continuum of how fresh does that water have to be before it stops being usable by any means by human activity, whether that's agriculture, even mining. After you hit a certain point, that water becomes unusable for any other purpose, and so that is what's now called a saline aquifer. And there are definitions for all these, and I can definitely talk about that if anyone's got questions about that after. Those are the things that we'll actually be using for injection. But first, the freshwater aquifers are always protected. The second, what protects them, geologically speaking, thousands of feet of what's called sedimentary overburden here. It's that impermeable unit that nothing gets through. No water, no CO2, no nothing. Not oil and gas, Nothing like that. That's why you never find oil and gas found really at the surface. They're also held by those impermeable zones. Next, you have the porous impermeable layer of your storage formation, the reservoir, saline aquifer, whatever you want to call it. That's what things are injected into. And often, that's also, if you're more familiar with oil and gas terms, it's those sort of formations that you'll also find oil and gas. They're not found in the same place as sequestration projects. We use different different areas, but in general, the concepts are very similar. And finally, you have to make sure that that CO2 that you're putting in the ground stays there, both from above and that it can't leak out below. So you also have to prove you have another impermeable confining zone underneath whatever zone you want to use for sequestration, for permanently locking that CO2 away. So how does it work? So today I have a little bit of an experiment to show. And what I'll be showing is that there's this misconception out here, and I apologize if it's a little hard to see, but we do encourage people afterwards to try it out for themselves, and I'll show you how it works. There's this misconception when we mention this porosity or permeability and what are you actually injecting into. A lot of people are thinking that there's these big open caverns. Sometimes people are thinking Louisiana, big open salt caverns. We actually try very hard to avoid all salt domes in carbon capture. They're not caverns. They're tiny microscopic spaces in between grains of the rock. Now, again, impermeable zones, I don't actually have an example of a seal rock or a confining zone because nothing can flow through them, so it would make my experiment a little hard. But what we're really looking for in all these experiments and in all the work we do is also to find where we have a confining zone and where things can flow through them. And so I'm going to walk around here real quick, and hopefully you can still hear me. I'll try yelling. I'm not that good
You
at
can
that.
grab one of the microphones here.
I'll just try yelling for now.
Okay.
Let me know if you can't hear me. So what we have here, and this comes from an organization called KeyCorp. It's an organization, and if you're interested in this atlas, please pay us afterwards, me and my team, that helps to spread the word on what carbon capture and sequestration is. This experiment shows 3 different cores of rock. These would be considered reservoir rock. Again, none of them would be considered seal because fluids can flow through them. If you come up, we do encourage you to come look at them for yourselves. You don't see with your naked eye any spaces here, but they're there. And so the way we're showing that is you can see this is a little aquarium. It's got 3 different cores of rock, each of a slightly different porosity and permeability that are all sitting in water. If those spaces are there, air should flow through them. And so what we've got are this green one, if you come up and see here, and it's also, you can see a little bit of green here, that is the most highly porous and permeable rock of the 3. That means it should be very easy for me to put a bike pump through it and pump water through it, or pump air through it, or whatever I want through the rock. You can't see the pores, they're there. It's very easy, and I do encourage everybody to come try it after. Very easy for me to just quickly pump on this pump, and I hope you can see that. I hope the wires aren't in the way. Bubbles flow through this. That's pretty easy. That would make an excellent reservoir. Next is one that's also pretty good, but these pore spaces are a little bit smaller, and they're a little bit less well connected. So it's a little bit harder to pump any air through them. So if I do that, I have to go kind of slow. If I go kind of slow, you can see I'm pumping pretty hard, but it takes a little longer for air to go through it. And it's a little bit harder. You can feel that pressure build up. The third one has the tiniest spaces of all the samples. And I do want to reiterate, it still would be more like a reservoir because things do flow through it. But you'll notice it takes a lot more energy on my part to pump anything through there, and it's taking quite a while for anything to go through. It's so hard, you almost don't see any bubbles. So let me try that again. If you're in the front, you just start little tiny bubbles because there's really not much space in that rock for things to go through. If I tried to do this with a true seal rock, I'd just be standing here with a bike pump like this because nothing's going to go through it. I can't get any air to go through a good seal. And that's the geological part of the system that protects all the drinking water. So now that I've kind of described what it is in the rocks we're looking for, I want to talk a little bit about, let me check this out. I'm telling you all of this, but all of this is over a mile underground. How do I know that that's what's happening under there? How do I be sure? And how do I make sure everything stays where it is? How do I make sure nothing leaks? And so actually, I have one other little thing here I brought. I joke, I always have to have a rock with me. This is what I do as a geologist. Now, these are perfectly cut cores from an easy-to-get-to place. In oil and gas, we're taking a very similar concept from oil and gas. This is a rock from an oil and gas reservoir offshore Louisiana that's actually the same thing Air Products and many other companies, the same rocks that we're using for sequestration, or will be using for sequestration. What we do is we drill a well, just a test well. We're just collecting data. We grab core out of that rock, and this is what it looks like. And you can see that there's 2 holes in that. We test this rock before anything starts to make sure we understand the porosity and permeability. That we understand this not only of the reservoir, which is very common in oil and gas to test this, but we also have to take samples out of the confining zone to make sure that that is not porous and permeable. And if you don't have all that parts of the system, you don't have a suitable system for sequestration. You can't use that. This data all becomes public information under what's called a Class 6 permit. And I'll talk a little bit about that next. So now I've described a little bit of the information we collect out of the well. Again, how do we make sure nothing gets through? We monitor it. We monitor it multiple ways. The first one is we drill this well. The first well we'll drill, it's a test well. And again, every company doing this has to do the exact same process, show that they have that information in hand. You have to make sure the well itself does not become a leak point. I've talked a lot about the rocks, but the wells themselves must be protected as well. How do you do that? Well, oil and gas wells have 2 big components to them. There's the casing, which is the pipe, basically, that you stick down the hole once you drill it, and you keep that hole open. That pipe itself must be made out of CO2-resistant metal, so that if CO2 ever does get introduced to the system, it cannot corrode. That's the pipe. Now, there's another piece of that here, too, and that is the cement that surrounds it. So if you just stick a pipe down hole, it can shake around. You don't do that in oil and gas. You cement it into place. It's got to stay there. The cement also has to be made out of CO2-resistant cement. That way, if it ever comes in contact with CO2, it stays intact, and nothing can flow through that. And you have to do very regular testing, all of which becomes public information, that that cement and the casing have remained perfectly intact and not corroded. If that starts to change, you again no longer have a viable system for sequestration, and you'd have to plug your well so that it never becomes a leak point. It never endangers any of your drinking water. Now our well, and I think I have a little poster. Is it in front of me? Sorry. I thought it's a little hard to see there, so I'm also, I think there's one there too. This is fairly typical of what's a monitor well. For Air Products, this is one thing we've submitted to the state, and it is also, again, public information for how we, again, know over time what's happening downhole. We collect physical samples of the rock, but we have to do more than that. And what we're seeing here, and again, you're welcome to come up after, and I'll point it out. It's a little hard to see. There's these red and blue lines here. The blue lines connect up to discrete pressure temperature monitors throughout the system. And again, it's a little hard to see, but you are more than welcome. We do encourage looking at how these work. We take pressure and temperature samples before measurements throughout the life of the project before anything starts to make sure you understand at what pressures the system started at and where it's going. If anything is unexpected over time, you have to figure out why. You may have to, in fact, stop all of your sequestration and figure out what's just happened that you didn't expect it, because you are monitoring it throughout. Now, those are discrete points. What happens if something happens in between those discrete points where you have those pressure temperature gauges? We have a red line that you'll see goes all the way to the surface, and you can see it's actually in multiple what they call casing strings. That's a fiber optic line, just like your internet, which is connected from the start to the finish by a very thin, basically a fiber optic system. We have the same thing. We'll have that in our well. That helps us measure pressure. That helps us measure temperature, acoustics, which is kind of stress, strain. Anything that might change in this system over time, we must monitor it those results become public information. And I say that because it's something that I think a lot of people don't realize just how much is fully available to the public that they can see. And so all of this must be continually monitored. Those fiber optics are running for 24/7, 365 for the entire life of the project, starting before, so you know what happens before you go into the ground, throughout the life of your injection project, and what is most likely going to become 50 years after you've stopped injection. It's not enough that you know what's happened during the life of the project. You must know what happens many years after you stop. So those fiber optics are cemented into place, and they are permanent. So one more. Now that I've said how we look for what happens, how do we ensure that nothing happens? And how do you know what any company's doing? I keep mentioning it's public information. It's public information. What does that mean? So I mentioned a Class 6 well. This is a type of injection well. What's actually quite interesting is it's not actually out of a sort of oil and gas regulation, which a lot of people think of because they think of wells as oil and gas related. These are actually under the Safe Water Drinking Act. They are called it's called a class of wells called the Underground Injection Control Wells. Sometimes you'll see it in public as UIC. Class 6 is one of 6 classes, the last one, of different wells used to inject different types of fluids into the subsurface. These have been going on for 50 years or more. And different types of injection wells can include saline water. It can include CO2. It can include other industrial things that go into similar systems, but these are the most stringent of any of the well types. It is built to ensure nothing gets into the drinking water, and long before you start injecting, these are the major permit requirements. You have to make sure your geological environment is conducive to sequestration, that it's conducive to a safe system, and that's the siting part. So that's kind of where a person like me would come into a project. Construction is the well design. Everything's out of CO2 resistant cement, or your casing is CO2 resistant. Nothing can get through that hole that you've drilled. Operation. That's how you're going to run the thing. This also can include if there are old wells in the area, and Louisiana's been in the oil and gas industry for over 100 years. There's a few wells in the area. That includes making sure none of them can become leak points either. So if you find anything, if you go to the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources and you work with them, they help you make sure if there is something in the area that might itself become a leak point, that you fix it long before you start. Testing. You have to make sure all the system stays and is doing what you expect it to throughout the entire life of your project and beyond. So now and then you have to shut in your wells and make sure they are not corroded, that they can hold the pressure you expect them to, and everything else. Again, this is all public information. Monitoring, kind of discussed, you have these wells. This is one of many types of monitoring, so that we can you monitor the surface and the air and the water. You also monitor your entire system miles below the ground. Everything has to be monitored. You must show you know where your CO2 is. And finally, it's very important that you close it correctly. So when your site is done injecting, you close up, you're not closed the day you stop injecting. You have to monitor it, and you're done after 50 years after injection stops. Once you do that, once you've proved nothing in the CO2 is moving anymore, then you are allowed to close it safely and ensure everything stays in place. So that's really what I had to share today. I do welcome any questions, and I definitely welcome anybody to try the experiments for themselves if anyone's kind of curious. But yes, thank you so much for listening to a talk on rocks.
How many of these sequestration sites are in Louisiana? Do we currently have it?
So at the moment, there are enhanced oil recovery sites, which is a very similar process but not exactly the same. At the moment, there are no true sequestration sites totally built yet. And there are different regulations going into place. For example, one of the things that will most likely happen very soon, all of this currently is under the EPA. We expect very soon that the Louisiana will take control over the Class 6 permits. And so I think once that happens, I think you'll see a lot more projects because the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources is very well staffed to be able to handle permits like these to come through, and then I think we'll see a lot more.
Can you talk about the economic impact? How many jobs are temporary? How many, are permanent jobs with a facility like this?
Well, so it's really hard to say for the entire industry. I know for Air Products, we'll have 170 new permanent jobs at the facility and over 2,000 construction jobs on this.